to Teacher Talks, a podcast where teachers from the Shorewood School District come together to share their knowledge around current topics. We have created this podcast to connect with students and community over this time of school closure due to the coronavirus. I am Mr. Kearns, Geometry and Algebra 2 teacher at Shorewood High School.
And I'm Mr. Nadolski, a math teacher at Shorewood Intermediate School. One of the effects that we have seen from the coronavirus pandemic is the increase in racist incidents towards Asian Americans. These incidents seem to be exacerbated by some politicians and significantly our own President Trump referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese flu. With us today are two SIS teachers, Sara, Anton, and Kelly Steiner, who will be talking to us about interrupting hate speech and bias. We'll talk to them not only about hate speech related to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also how to address hate speech and microaggressions in the school setting. Kelly and Sara, thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, but not be here.
Virtually here, you're here. And I'm excited that this is our first podcast with 4 people, so that's exciting.
Ooh, level up.
Yeah, right.
All right. Hello, Kelly and Sara. So it's great to see you guys again. It's been a while, and I'm just kind of wondering, how are you doing? Kelly, how was your first day of virtual learning?
So far, so good. We gave the students a lot of choice, so I don't know yet how that's going for them. But as a parent trying to teach multiple grade levels at home also, today has been our best day so far, knock on wood.
All right, that is good to hear. Sara, how have you been up to the school closure? What have you been up to?
We've, my spouse and my 3 kids and I have been hanging in there, and today is our first official virtual learning day, both for me as a teacher as well as a mom of the 3 girls I have. So, we're hanging in there. There were only some small tantrums. One of them was for me, but it's been good so far. It's been great. It's great to see my students' faces on Flipgrid and hear how they're doing and connect with them.
Very good. It's been cool to hear about kind of the creativity that families are kind of coming up with, new ideas of how to schedule the day. It's cool to see that. So today we're talking about kind of this hate speech, and there's been a couple of incidents that kind of have stuck out to me just the past couple of weeks. We've been hearing of lots of Asian immigrants, Asian Americans in the U.S. getting harassed. We've also heard of local Chinese restaurants. Lucky Liu's in Milwaukee had to close because of incidents of harassment towards their employees. We had last year, I think it was, we had the attack on a Hispanic man on the South Side. And I'm just wondering, what can we do, both as teachers and just people in society, to help make kind of this world more respectful and kind of stop these actions?
Sara, I'll let you kick that off if you're ready for it, because you got to kick off our last talk about this and you're really good at that.
Sounds great. Yeah, it's no pressure. No, I'll do my best. But I think it's one of the most important things is just being able to stand up and say something. Kelly and I work with Ally Club. It's a group of students at SIS. And when we talked to students earlier this year about, if you had the ear of teachers, of other adult leaders, of other community members, what would you want those adults to know about interrupting biased speech? And across the board, the kids said, well, we want everyone to just know to say something when there's a microaggression, especially because when students hear these things going on, whether they're just seemingly small things, and I'm putting that in air quotes here, I'm not sure if that's taped right, or if they seem to be much more direct things, students wonder, well, if they didn't say anything, is it because they didn't hear it? Is it because they actually agree with it? Is it just that they're confused about what to say? So I think it's really important that we are able to say something and practice saying something, because silence, especially to our kids, especially especially to our students as well as our kids at home, really means being complicit in some ways. So we don't want to be complicit, right? We want to teach them and be proactive around that. I think that's an important thing. Kelly, what do you think? What do you want to add?
I think, yeah, one of the other things the students said is they, then they have to wonder where the teacher stands on it, but also that makes them wonder whether or not it's okay for them to stand up. So even if a student was prepared to, step in on something hurtful that was said, or to explain that someone had been misgendered or whatever the incident was, when the teacher doesn't say anything, they're like, well, does that mean the teacher's not okay if I say something? And so it adds a whole nother level of complexity, even for the youth who are ready to start doing some of that interrupting on their own.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the things our Ally Club kids love the most is when we practice the interrupting, not just in the school setting, but also really in any setting, whether it's with their friends, or we sometimes sit down and have a pretend Thanksgiving dinner where we role play out, well, what would you say to this relative or this family friend who would say something? We kind of talk through, how do you stand up to this? We go through the steps, we model. And I think that modeling is so important, because all of us, kids and adults, if it's something that really really gets us in an emotional place, sometimes it's easy to let that emotion carry us away, instead of kind of taking that moment to gather ourselves and think, okay, how can we respond in a way that doesn't make us feel good, or, oh, I really showed them, but rather, how do we respond in a way where we're going to get people to think, and we're going to want to inspire change, or at least have people reflect on what they said.
So one of the things about microaggressions, which both of you have mentioned, is that they're often very subtle, and by definition, by their name, they're micro in a sense, and their subtlety. So oftentimes, I think it's difficult for some people, some adults, some educators, especially those like myself of the dominant culture, to recognize a microaggression. How do we recognize a microaggression when it happens in the classroom? How do I know when something that I say or something a student says is making another student feel uncomfortable?
That's a great question. And it kind of brings up the fact that the word microaggression is by itself a microaggression, because who am I to say that that slight was micro or should be micro to you? But it does, I think, sometimes help people understand that racism, bias, hate speech can be more than people in white robes, more than burning crosses. Like, that's an extreme form of individual racism, but that because our whole society is built on racist premises, everything about our society is built on some really false ideas that get reinforced all the time. And so the small ways that that comes up in our conversations and our expectations can all influence how well we make a space safe for kids. So then, kind of directly to your point, how do I know what not to say or what shouldn't be said? And I think that there's a few tiers of this. So to start with, I would say if something just doesn't sit quite right with you as an educator, or if something seems like it targeted an individual or a group of individuals, or if it seems like something was said to a student that related to one of the aspects of their identity, it's probably a good bet that that was a step in that direction. And even if you're not sure, when we talk about the steps that we use to interrupt microaggressions and bias speech, we start with an interrupt and then a question. We'll explain both of those. But I think if one of those things has gone off, you just kind of, that spidey sense of like, yeah, it didn't feel right, or something seemed based on identity, is a good time to throw in an interrupt and a question. Like, that didn't feel quite right to me. Rather, I said it as a teacher, because I do, or another student said it, and that didn't feel quite right to me, and that could be my interrupt. And then I could say, what do you think? How did you hear that? Well, how might that relate to identity, or whatever the follow-up question that helps you figure out whether or not that was. And as another tier, I think it's important to always be learning. especially, I'll speak for myself, I come from a dominant culture, and I went to school almost entirely in a dominant culture. And so I was deprived of perspectives of people unlike me until probably college. And so I am at least 20 years behind the curve all the time trying to catch up. So I work really hard to understand some of the history, to understand some of the text, so that I can be more sensitive to and aware of those things when I hear them.
And I think I would probably add too that beyond just educating yourself as being something really important, I think one of the things that we see with students, but also with adults, I mean, even with ourselves, when we're saying something and it is based in some aspect of someone's identity, even if it's something meant to be positive, or even if the intent is positive, a lot of times students who we talk to say, well, oh, I meant that as a compliment. When I say, oh, well, people like you are good at X, Y, and Z, we tell the kids, well, hold on. We interrupt, we say something, we say, well, hold on, tell me more by what you meant by that. Because even if the intent was positive, even if it was meant to be something complimentary to an individual, we still want to interrupt it and then question it and say, well, even though you meant that as something to be positive, what the underlying message might be is people of your identity do not often have this particular positive attribute we're complimenting you about. So I know that that's a small example there, but just being aware that even if it doesn't come off as negative, even if the intent is positive, the impact that that statement has can be something that's really hurtful.
And I think lots of microaggressions are supposed to be compliments, or they're meant as compliments. You're really a credit to your race. You're really good at math for a girl. You're Asian, of course you're going to be good at this math. And I guess I'm just thinking math because we're talking to you guys. Any of those things, like, oh, I can tell of course you're going to be great at the Spanish. You have a lot of passion, as a Latinx person. But I also, like, we both referenced if it relates to someone's identity. And so just in the interest of being clear, when we say identity, it can mean any of the ways that a person might identify or describe themselves. That could be race, ethnicity, that could be gender, that could be sexual orientation, it could be gender identity, that could be religion, that could be age, that could be ability or disability. I'm missing some. Sarah, help me out.
Okay, age, ability. Come back to me. It'll come to me in a moment. I'm trying to remember the ones you said. Age, so we had race, ethnicity, gender, gender expression, gender identity, socioeconomic status.
There you go.
One.
Yes. Religion, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's great insight. And now what I really liked from what you just said was kind of that it was towards the beginning of what you just talked about, and that idea of by not stepping in, you're allowing that action to I guess control what's going on, and to be okay. So I think we can all pretty much agree that it is our job, especially as educators, to step in when we hear a microaggression occurring in our school or in our classroom. Do you have any steps as to how that should look as a teacher to step in to start a conversation about that?
Why, yes, we do. We should clarify, we don't have these steps. We teach these to our students and sometimes to colleagues, and they come from Teaching Tolerance. It's from their Speak Up at School program. There are lesson plans. There's a pocket guide. It's really awesome, and I would recommend any educators to check that out. And as a side note, to reinforce what you just said, early in my time in the Shorewood School District, we had a focus on character education, and an author named Hal Urban came in and spoke to us. And one of the catchphrases he said that really hit me was, what you permit, you promote. And so when we permit stuff to get said, that's what we're promoting in our classroom. And that I was a relatively new teacher, and it, really took my sense of developing classroom management, again with the air quotes, to a whole nother level of like, oh, whoa, I need to be mindful about that.
Right.
So the first thing, since we don't want to promote that, we don't want to permit it, so we don't want to promote it. The first step in the Speak Up at School guide from Teaching Tolerance is to interrupt. So every time you hear something, the interrupt is just to put a placeholder in the conversation, just to keep the flow from going over that. And the goal with all of these steps is to use only as many as are necessary to help the person who has said something harmful to know that they should fix it and how to fix it. So sometimes an interrupt is enough. It's important that the interrupt is non-confrontational and non-judgmental. So it might be something like, or hold on a second, or wait. But it has to be done in such a way that you can take some of that tone out of it. I personally struggle at this because I get pretty feisty pretty quick. So my go-to interrupt is, because I can make that sound and it comes from the same place and my heart is, but I can make it come out sounding nice. And I think one of the many skills that teachers have that non-teachers don't always appreciate is our ability to think very loud things in our head and say very quiet things with our mouths. So I can think, oh, good Lord, and say, And so that's what works for me. Depending on how much feeling I have to let myself process through is how long my tends to be.
Yeah, it's a teacher gift, really. I think it's a parent gift to anyone really who works with people. Maybe we all can develop it, right? But I love the interrupt because, like Kelly said, it gives you this time to cool yourself down, to kind of collect yourself in a way that's non-judgmental looking and sounding. And it gives you this pause before step 2, which is question. And the idea behind question is just like Kelly said, you don't employ the question if the interrupt works. And sometimes it does, which is great, right? Like sometimes if someone says something like, oh, you people are all good at that, and you go, huh, and you kind of pause, then hopefully the person kind of backtracks and goes, oh, wait, no, I'm sorry, that came out wrong. What I meant was, right? But if the interrupt doesn't work, then the question is just a non-judgmental, open-ended question that really puts it back on the speaker. So some great questions that we use are, oh, what did you mean by, and then you use the term, or you use the term that the person maybe used that might have been something biased, or what did you mean by that? Or if it's a joke, for example, then sometimes it can be a, why is that funny? And again, like Kelly said, the tone is so important because the way that, why is that funny versus, like in earnest, why is that funny? Like kind of playing dumb, pretending that you don't understand what's going on there. So that would be step 2. If the interrupt doesn't do it, then the question is step 2.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? So what's the intention of interrupting in a non-judgmental way? Like, why would I not want to communicate to students that I find that language to be inappropriate? So what's the intention of interrupting in a non-confrontational or non-judgmental way?
I think because what we want is for the kids to learn, or whoever has said it, to learn, and not just to respond to this immediate behavior, but to actually know how and why to do differently in the future. And so I think early in my development to this, before Sara taught me the 4 steps, I really did a very whack-a-mole version of like, no, it's not okay to say that. Like, oh, no, that's not okay to say that. Or let me just drop some knowledge on you of why that's offensive. But we know that as soon as somebody comes at us like that, our kind of hackles go up, and we're not going to learn. We might stop what we're saying in the moment, but we won't actually learn. And the goal of being able to approach it non-judgmentally is that we increase the likelihood that the students are going to actually get what we're trying to explain to them about why it's a problem, and not just fix this instance, but the next one or the next several hundred for the rest of their lives, maybe even someday help teach that same thing to someone else. So it's the difference between my original approach, which was whack-a-mole, and sort of like the ripple effect, but you have to enter the pond gently to make the ripple effect work.
Exactly,
Okay.
right? And I think all human beings don't like hearing that they're doing something wrong or that they're doing something offensive. And I think for a lot of students and for a lot of people, right, we want the opportunity to make it right ourselves instead of feel like someone else is calling us out or forcing us to change. And so it really leaves that door open for the reflection, not just from kids, but from adults too.
So we have step one, which is interrupt. Step two is question.
And so sometimes the question is enough, because sometimes someone will talk themselves right out of it. And again, it's interesting how if you can go into the question with genuine curiosity, it is interesting because we know that someone has said something problematic, but we don't know if they didn't know that it was problematic, if they knew but it was coming from an internal struggle, if they really believe something terrible about a group of people. And so using that question gives us more information. It's like in teaching, it's our pre-assessment, and it helps us really target the third step, which is education. So in the third step, if the interrupt wasn't enough, and then the question wasn't enough, and they're still persisting in some problematic beliefs or wording, then we use the educate to help fill in the gap. So for example, if, I don't know, let me just magically imagine my mother-in-law called to check on us and how we were all doing with this Chinese virus. And I recognize that the CDC and the World Health Organization have purposely not named this based on a place because of the problems of racist and assumptions and harassment that have happened when people have used that term, like you said at the beginning. And so if I said, because I needed some and I could, take a moment. And then I said, well, why that term for what's going on? Like, tell me more about that. And she followed up with, well, that's what they say on the news, because, that's where all this started. And so that's this whole problem is that, we got all these people who keep coming to this country who don't belong here. And now we end up with these new sicknesses that we never had before. So her imaginary lead-in gives me, I can see where the gaps are in her understanding, and it helps me target what my follow-up is. So I could say, I have heard that on the news too, but what's been interesting to me is who I have and haven't heard use that term on the news. So I've heard politicians, and especially politicians who really aim to get people riled up and who use a lot of hurtful speech using that term, but I haven't heard any doctors, any health professionals, anyone from the CDC or the World Health Organization use that term. The term I've heard them use is novel or new coronavirus, because this virus is new in this form, or COVID-19 as the disease that it caused. And I'm pretty sure that they chose that term because they didn't want to isolate and alienate a group of people. But if the answer to the question had been different, then maybe my educate would have needed to be different. That was
And I think the educate too is one of those places where everybody, regardless of how much you know, there's always time and place to learn more, right? And as new things evolve, as new things come up in our world, right? I think the more we can self-educate, the more we can just dig into those resources around us. It doesn't matter if we're kindergartners or if we're someone's great-great-grandparent, right? There's always time and place to educate.
Yeah, I think so.
Go ahead.
I think with that education part, it's also, I think it's such an important step. And I think when, as a kind of a new teacher and I guess part of kind of that dominant culture, it does sometimes make me feel uncomfortable if, like, I don't know if I'm educating in the correct way, or and am I saying something wrong by educating this way, or I guess just practicing that and having that kind of confidence, I guess, to feel like I can educate people on that is something that I'm working on. Do you have any advice as far as that goes?
Ooh, we do. We've tried this with students a few times, and what we found is if there's something you're pretty sure it's not okay to say, but you don't know why, you could start your educate portion with, I'm pretty sure it's not okay to say that, but I'm not sure why. Let's look it up together, because we all carry Google machines in our pocket. Sara and I have tested out why can't you say, and then filled in the blank with lots and lots of things. And we almost always, in the first one or two Google hits, get a pretty good start as to why. And even if you do know, it's okay to say, I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to say that. Let's look up, let's look that up together.
I like that. I like that a lot.
For sure.
So what's the fourth step? We've interrupted, we've questioned, we have educated based on that question, and what's step number 4 then?
So the last step, the big level up, is the echo. And the echo, just like what you would imagine, you can't always do it if you don't have a second or third or fourth voice in the room. But the echo is the two-person either coming in to support someone else who's standing up against biased speech, or you're the person who's kind of soliciting that third opinion so that you're getting backup. So if you've done your interrupt, if you've done your question, if you've done your educate, you've talked to this hypothetical mother-in-law, for example, and they're just still not convinced, maybe they say, oh, well, I don't know about that. I think my sources aren't biased. I'm hearing it from all of these places. I believe this politician I'm talking to. If you're still not getting the message through with the previous 3 steps, then that's a great place to say, well, I don't know, turn to friend next to you. What do you think? And then hopefully that friend next to you can say, you know what, I do agree with Kelly. I don't think that that's an appropriate thing to say. And, the effects of calling this a Chinese virus or calling it something else that's racially motivated, those are really damaging. I've got a friend who identifies as Asian American, and after this week of living here in the United States and being from here and living here with her 2 young daughters, she was harassed several times, and she went to the Humane Society and adopted a really big dog to walk with her so that she felt safe when she would bring her small girls out to a park. So just being able to make those connections and being able to pull in those other voices, those other allies to just to share those stories, to amplify the stories so that the person who is standing up is not alone in giving that message.
So,
And I think you can volunteer the echo too. So if I hear, Sam start to interrupt something and I can see the struggle, I can physically put myself, okay, maybe not right now. I can, in a Zoom meeting, put myself a line there. I can nod, I can, signal some agreement. And then when there's an opportunity, say, thanks for speaking up, Sam. I think that's really important and that really helps.
Mm-hmm.
And so that reinforces that. So I'm thinking as a teacher, oftentimes I'm the only adult in the room, and so I've gone through the first 3 steps, and so am I looking for the potential of having a student be my echo, or is that a little different if I'm in a classroom setting and I'm the only adult in the room?
Do you want to take this first, Sarah?
I think one would hope, right? Hopefully, and that's why we love working with, our students at SIS with Ally Club. Hopefully, we're not the only voice in the room who's standing up. Hopefully, us standing up to biased speech, even if we as the adults don't hear that echo come from another kid in the moment, just by us standing up, that again, that ripple effect might be that maybe in the hallway later on, someone approaches the person who said the biased thing and said, I agreed with Mr. Nadolski. I think he was right when he said that. Or maybe we're just kind of sending out, even if the echo doesn't happen in that moment, even if we're the only adult in the room, and even if we don't necessarily see that happening from that particular incident, we're hoping that as kids talk to one another and as they say you as the adult and us as the adults or other adults in their lives, parents, coaches, other community members, they see that and they're going to notice it. And even if they don't notice it in that exact incident or in that exact moment, the fact that we did say something and that we did speak up is powerful enough to really kind of ripple toward that kid being inspired to stand up in the future.
That's great. I really appreciate those 4 steps, and I'm able to reflect on my time teaching and think about times where I have interrupted, but maybe not followed through on those steps, and maybe it wasn't as impactful as it could have been, or when maybe I felt that sort of feeling like maybe that was something that was inappropriate or a microaggression, and I didn't say anything. And I can think of a couple times in that when I reflect back on that. So having these sort of steps in place makes me feel a lot more confident to address it in a way that is concrete for me as someone who likes things that are a little bit more concrete and a little bit more enumerated like that. But like to Stephen's point too, I think it takes a little practice, and looking for that echo or looking for someone that can kind of step in and support you if you're struggling. Or I really like the tip of like, well, let's just look up why that language might not be good. If I can't articulate that right off the cuff like that, I can use some resources, and that also shows to the students that I'm not infallible, that I have to look things up as well, which I think is also a good lesson for our students.
Absolutely.
I think none of us have ever been perfect at this. Even since Sara has taught me the 4 steps, I am far from perfect about this. I think it's important for us to remember it's about progress, not perfection. That, we need to keep doing the best we can. You can't wait until you know you're going to do it perfectly. Don't wait until you know you have the perfect educate. It's more powerful to be making progress at interrupting and then just getting better at that process as you go than it is to get all of them right. And again, only use many of the 4 steps as you need before the person is kind of changing gears. Sometimes it works itself out before you get to the echo. I also think, because you said like in the classroom, if the echo doesn't work as a person, I think the echo can also be you later following up. I think you could, wait till okay, so we paused what we were learning about circles, and, we had this conversation, and now we're going to go back to circles. We're going to finish the lesson. But on the way out, I want to check with that kid at the door and be like, hey, it was really brave of you to engage in that conversation with me. How are you feeling about that? How are you doing? Are you and I okay? Because you're reinforcing, like, I'm not going to take back challenging you on that, but I still care about you, because you're inviting them to continue that conversation. I think you at a later time can still be the echo.
Right.
Absolutely. And, like Kelly said, it's so important to just know that the kids, none of our students have come to us and said, we felt we'd rather that teacher would have just said nothing as opposed to stood up for us, but awkwardly. I mean, we're middle school teachers. Everything about middle school and teaching is awkward. Am I right? So, right? We may as well embrace the awkward. And I would much rather have a bumbling, awkward response to something that was biased speech and then learn from it, than to just kind of sit and be silent and then have the students imagine whatever they would want to imagine that came out of that silence, right? As long as we're saying something, I think our students are learning from our example, even if it's a totally awkward, imperfect example.
Well, that was really enlightening, and I think that's also a very beautiful place to end. That when we hear something or we recognize something, it's important for us to follow those 4 steps. It's important for us to say something. Otherwise, we're complicit in that action, and we're enabling that action to kind of persist in our classroom. So we are going to wrap up our podcast for today. Sara and Kelly, thank you so much for joining us. I know that was really enlightening for me, and I'm really appreciative of you giving us your time today. We like to wrap up our podcast with a Shorewood shout out, where we recognize something positive that's going on in the Shorewood community. Stephen's got our Shorewood shout out for us today, so take it away, Stephen.
It's time for your Shorewood shout out. Yeah, we want to do a Shorewood shout out today to all of the teachers around the country in general, for all their hard work, learning this completely new way of teaching for many of us, and just giving it their all. Everyone's trying to do their best. And I think it's just really cool to see everything that comes out of this weird situation that we're in, unique situation that we have. So shout out to all the teachers for all the hard work that you're doing. And thank you again, Sara and Kelly. I learned just having the ability to kind of combat these microaggressions with more of a growth mindset orientation to it instead of a whack-a-mole. So it's a learning experience for everyone involved. So thank you all for that. Thank you everyone for listening. And we hope you have a great day.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Charlotte.
having us.
Thanks, everyone.